Hi Team Plants. Here's a little mini lecture on maintenance considerations that we have to have in mind when we do planting design. So first off, a dose of reality. There's no such thing as a no maintenance landscape. I mean, unless you're just talking about straight up Mother Nature landscapes. And even Mother Nature does her own maintenance. It just looks a little bit different than the way that we do it. Some other things to think about. In the real world, maintenance activities are thought about in terms of a contract, and contracts are thought about in terms of what activities have to be done at what frequency, whether that's weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, during the growing season, quarterly, annually. That is how maintenance companies think about doing maintenance in the landscape. There's also two different kinds of work, something that I will call additive, which is where fertilizer is being applied, mulch is being applied, things are being added to the landscape, and subtractive. And those involve pruning, trimming, deadheading, debris removal, things like that. Lastly, we don't deal with this in this class, but if there's an irrigation system on site, there's always some time spent with every maintenance visit that makes sure that that irrigation system is running properly and in order. So I've broken up this lecture into the categories of plant forms, like the ones that were covered during the schematic plant form and functional type lecture. So we're going to start with turf grasses. And if there's anything that you take away from this, it is that turf grasses require full sun to do their best. Full sun, full sun, full sun, full sun, full sun. Full sun. And for turf grasses, full sun means 6 hours or more of sunlight a day. You can sometimes get away with 4 to 6, but you're towing the line there. Under 6 hours of sunlight a day, turf grasses are more susceptible to weed intrusion and also disease. A couple other things to think about with turf grasses in terms of their maintenance is that we try to only put in turf grass at a narrowest width of 22 inches. Let me restate that. We don't do any turf grass areas that are narrower than 22 inches wide because that is the standard width of a push mower. And we try to reduce any areas that would have to be mowed over either twice because maybe it was like 27 inches or once and it's over something else because it's like 16 inches. We also try to make any corners in lawn areas as close to 90 degrees as possible. Makes it easier to maintain a 90-degree corner with the equipment. It's also easier to irrigate a corner that's 90 degrees. And then if we do have to do anything curvilinear in terms of the edging, we try to use wider, gentler arcs as opposed to tighter, more sinuous arcs. Again, because it is easier to mow and to irrigate. Some more things that we think about with turf grass. If we have turf grass growing up next to a building, it's a good idea to put what we call a maintenance edge between the end of that lawn area and the building foundation itself. And that maintenance edge is just a bit of space that does not have a turf grass as a cover that maintenance workers could use to stand in to do their work, to do their maintenance work. And we would either cover that area in a brown mulch, like a shredded bark, or even a stone mulch, like a gravel. I don't like to do maintenance edges any narrower than 12 inches. I really prefer to do them at least 18 inches wide. 24 inches is even better. It just gives a person enough space to do the work that they need to do. We also need to think about what kind of grass is planted and whether it is a more aggressive grass that could spread through stolons above ground or rhizomes below, or if it is a less aggressive grass and maybe does not spread so much. If we have an aggressive grass next to an area where we don't want that grass to intrude upon, we need to think about using an edging, like a steel edging or an aluminum edging or a plastic edging. Otherwise, if either we cannot have an edging or we're using a grass that is not aggressive, we would think about maintaining that turf grass edge with a shovel cut. And that's just where a maintenance worker would come at some interval with a shovel and just cut off any stolons that were intruding into the area we didn't want. Annuals, seasonal color. These often get planted near roadways because it's the entrance to a commercial area, or it might be a roadway median. But roadways are a very dangerous environment, and so we need to think about designing annual beds so that workers could install and change out those plants safely without having to get into the roadway. So having a little bit of some buffer space that would allow workers to work the beds without being in the road is important. We also need to remember that oftentimes annual beds are prepared with a little tiller. And so, just recognizing that it's not just going to be one person's body, it's going to be somebody operating a small tiller. If there's any adjacency with a building or some sort of structure, keeping these same things in mind about providing enough work is a good idea so that there's some offset between those annuals and that structure. And this is a mistake I made in my very first job, we need to know the mature height of the annuals and make sure that they aren't going to grow so tall in the growing season that they are going to obscure any important signage or lighting that is in the bed. In my job, I planted some coleus near a subdivision sign, and that coleus at maturity would be 2 feet tall, and that was the complete height of the sign. So my company had to cut down the coleus every week to make sure that that sign was still visible before winter came. But well, another important thing with annuals is that we have to match the annuals to the actual sun-shade conditions in where they're being planted. You don't plant shade plants in sun areas and vice versa. We also need to keep on top of whether an annual is problematic in the area that we're working. Some plants just don't do as well, even though they're sold. So it's always a good idea to talk to nursery staff or maintenance people and double check that what you're specifying performs well. And then lastly, we always need to know if they will require freeze protection or not. So ground covers. Just like with annuals, we want to minimize the work that is done on ground covers adjacent to roadways. So if any trimming or mowing happens regularly, we want to rethink how we're designing that ground cover area to minimize exposure to roadways, or honestly, to completely eliminate it. Another good thing to remember is that grass-like ground covers are usually cut back once a year, usually late winter, early spring, and they're cut not completely to the ground, but within 6 to 12 inches of the ground, and then they reemerge from that. Finding ground covers, we need to be thoughtful about how much fluff they're allowed to put on. Some vining ground covers will grow with a more of an arching habit, or even use its own stems as a scaffold and climb up. And in those instances, we may need to think about ground staking, which is basically taking a giant bobby pin and anchoring branches of that vining ground cover to the ground. And we also may need to think about whether they need to be cut back. And of course, if we have a vining ground cover next to some shrubs, it's a good idea to put some space between the two so that the vine doesn't use the shrub as a scaffold and grows up it. Speaking of that, vines. There are a lot of vines with thorns and spines, and you have to be really thoughtful about specifying something that's thorny or spiny. If you remember gravity, and if you are pruning or maintaining a vine and its branches overhead and you're not able to catch it when it falls, it can basically become a little mace and just stick you in the shoulder. This has happened to me. It is not fun. You also need to be mindful of what kind of maintenance work would need to be done at what height. And there's typical thresholds that companies have to respect in terms of their workman's comp insurance, that if the company is doing work on ladders at a height over 6 feet above the ground or above 14 feet above the ground, that may limit the work they can do. You may have to enlist a tree company to do maintenance on taller things because they carry the insurance that allows them to work above that 14-foot height safely. Something that we also have to keep in mind is that it takes time to train vines into a certain pattern. So if you have a diamond-shaped trellis, you can't just plant the vine and walk away and the vine is like, oh, of course, I will grow into a diamond pattern. You're welcome. No, it takes time for people to start weaving the tendrils around that structure. And then lastly, we just have to remember that it takes time for a vine to grow to its mature height. It doesn't just happen immediately where it just jumps up and jumps on top of this pergola like this wisteria here. It does take a few years. Also, when it does grow up to that height, it takes time to maintain that. Ornamental grasses. A big thing to think about with ornamental grasses is that the blades of ornamental grasses, the leaves, actually can be quite sharp at the edges. Really sharp, in fact. Not something that you can just push through in shirt sleeves and short shorts and expect to come out on the other side without blood just dripping down you. So be mindful if you're planting an ornamental grass next to something where a maintenance worker would have to work a lot, say like an irrigation controller, recognizing that grass could pose a safety risk. With perennials, we need to think about how many times a year the perennial might need to be cut back, either to promote a new flush or to control it. We need to remember that if they are flowering and their dead flowers are unattractive, there would be time required for those to be removed, to be deadheaded. Perennials also tend to capture fallen tree leaves that fall to the ground and blow through, and they act like a little net or a weir catching those, and it takes time to keep those clean, to remove those fallen tree leaves. Other things with perennials, we need to know if they're browsed by wildlife, like deer, and like annuals if they require freeze protection. Shrubs. Kind of like vines, we need to think about if they're thorny or spiny and think about where we're placing them in terms of what might be, if they're next to a high use area by maintenance workers. You wouldn't want to plant something really treacherous, heavily armed, next to a place where a worker would have to do a lot of work or pruning that might push them into those. For deciduous shrubs, we need to think about when do their leaves fall, how long is the leaf drop, and also do the leaves decompose readily or not. If they don't decompose readily, there will be time spent removing those leaves. We also need to think about if fallen fruit is some sort of hazard, whether it's because it's spiny or sharp or messy or large enough and hard enough that it could cause somebody to trip on. Will it stain concrete? If so, we need to place it back from that sidewalk, from that hardscape, to prevent that staining. And then, of course, we need to remember that if we are, per our design, intending that shrub to be in a form that is not its natural form, that requires time for workers to maintain it in that form. More shrub considerations. It's a good idea to be aware of if a shrub is a host for pests. Sometimes a shrub could be a host for a pest that seriously impacts another plant, but not the host shrub itself. So please keep that in mind. And again, nursery staff or maintenance workers are a great source for this information. It's also really important to respect the shrub's mature size and to space the planting in a way that will allow them to be their mature size and still have good airflow. Why is this important? Because if you have a high humidity condition, either artificially or because of the climate you're in, that puts shrubs at a greater risk for fungal disease, because fungus loves moisture, and airflow, of course, dries moisture out, moves it along. So just remember that really close spacing creates an opportunity for high humidity, which is a friendly environment to fungus. Just like with turf grasses, it's also a good idea to provide a maintenance edge between any shrub plantings and a building, just to give workers space to work around and to maintain that shrub. Also promotes good airflow. Being aware of if shrubs are browsed by wildlife like deer. Important to know, especially if you are working on a project that is next to a wildlife area. And then if the shrub prefers a soil of a certain kind of acidity, whether that's acid or more neutral or more basic. For example, azaleas and rhododendrons prefer acidic soils, and if your client wants hydrangeas to have pink blooms, if the bloom color is not already set by the cultivar, planting that in a more acid soil will be important. Trees. Many of these are the same considerations of some of the other plants, but one of the most important ones is that we try to avoid planting trees under power lines if we can. And if we have to plant a tree under a power line, we try to plant it that it won't grow tall enough to encroach on that power line. If you can imagine being sent up a tree with a piece of power pruning equipment with a power line nearby, that is not a safe situation. It has to be done very carefully. We try to avoid creating those kinds of situations for workers. We also want to think about thorns or spines that appear on the tree. Again, this can be a safety consideration if you're having to work in a tree that has thorns and spines that are part of it. For deciduous trees, we need to think about their leaf drop, timing, duration, and if those leaves decompose readily or not. If they don't, they will have to be removed. And same with shrubs. Is fallen fruit a hazard, either because it's spiny or sharp, could cause a trip, be something that you could trip on, and also does it make a mess? Will the fruit stain the concrete of a nearby hardscape? If so, you have to push it to the side. Does it decompose readily? Does it need to be removed? Again, like with shrubs, thinking about your intended form of that tree compared to its natural form is very important. If you are wanting that tree to be maintained in a form that is not in its nature, that will require time to prune it. Also, being aware of if that tree is a host for pests, and you could possibly be putting other plants in your landscape at risk or be requiring treatment sprays that you may or may not want. If trees are browsed by wildlife, also, if trees can actually acidify soils. This is the case with pine trees. Pine straw, which is the industry term for pine needles. Pine straw, as it breaks down, actually acidifies soil. Not crazy acid level like Joker throwing acid at people, but it definitely brings that pH below 7, which is great for rhododendrons and azaleas and hydrangeas that you want to have pink blooms, but it may not be great for all plants. So you have to be aware of that. And then, of course, if we want to help our trees not be injured by maintenance equipment, it's a good idea to put a mulch ring at the base. That is to say, to design an area a certain distance from the tree that does not have turf grass on it, so that somebody operating either a push or a riding mower or a weed eater is not going to wound or injure that tree and possibly introduce disease in maintaining the turf around it. So that's it. If you have any questions, let me know, and we will hear more about these things in a future class.